Hi, everybody. You just caught me chit-chatting with an old friend. I'm so excited to welcome our next guest, Dean Amale Andraos, to Design and Dialogue. It's been a little while since we've been in touch, and thank you so much for joining us. I guess as an intro, it's a very lengthy intro, but I've kind of reduced it for our purposes. I think I'll start by saying that Amale was born in Beirut, Lebanon, and has lived all over the world, including Canada, France, the Netherlands, and Saudi Arabia. As a founding partner of the critically acclaimed architecture studio Work AC with her husband, architect Dan Wood, and the first female dean of Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture Planning and Preservation, Amale Andraos is one of the foremost practitioners and thinkers in the fields of architecture and architectural education. Just want to... At Columbia, her leadership has been described as bringing real-world problems into the curriculum with a bold vision and strong leadership. Our conversation today will focus on her multiple personal and professional roles, the future of architectural education, her work with her partner, Dan Wood at Work AC, and her ongoing engagement to the crucial issues of our time across all scales of the built environment. So with that, I'd like to welcome Amale. Thank you.
Stephen. It's a great pleasure to be here in such an interesting kind of series, and was excited to hear you're leading some of these, and so looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think we're going to begin with a series of images that that you've just discovered for the first time. We had a very interesting kind of test call earlier this week, Amale and I, and she was calling in from the car with her family on board, and we talked about the fact that I'd like to begin by understanding your early relationship to design. So obviously your father was an architect, we know that, and so I'm wondering if you could tell us about these beautiful images.
Sure. So my father is an architect and a painter. He really actually wanted to be a painter, but then it wasn't professional enough for his father, so he was called back to complete his architectural education. But this is one of his most, he didn't practice much in Lebanon because of the war, and this is one of his main projects. It's a school, very, very progressive school, well known in Lebanon, called Collège Louise Wegman. And I still meet students or alumni who remember the school, and especially the cafeteria that was this collective space. And so yeah, architecture and design's been really kind of part of my life. And what I love about the upper right image is, it's this kind of time in Lebanon and all over the world where there was aspiration to embrace progressive ideas and to kind of engage with modernity through architecture. It was a kind of really rich project.
Amale, can you give us a sense of what year this was?
This is right before the war, and so I would assume it's early 70s, probably.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Beautiful. And this is a picture of you?
Yeah, so soon after the war started, we moved to Saudi Arabia, so I left everything, and then because my father started a company there for prefabricated housing, affordable housing, and so this is our second home in Al Khobar. And this is my young brother, Philippe, who was meant to be the heir, but and my father in Arabian Polyfab, which was the compound that kind of my father kind of designed, and this is where people who worked in the firm lived as well.
Mm. Mm.
This is one of his early projects in terms of housing, so it was really about prefabrication and modularity. And then soon after, there were kind of new experiments with lightweight construction, and trying to stack and again kind of push modularity forward. And the lower one I still remember. Well, I remember these as kind of types, but the lower one I remember was a very big experiment because he, along with the engineer group he was working with, developed this Humro product, which was kind of lightweight concrete. And so he was very interested in experimenting with materials as well.
Wow, wow, fantastic. This is incredible.
So this is an earlier photo, and I put it here because I actually mentioned this house at the graduation speech this past May. I was thinking about loss and trying to connect with the students in terms of their feeling of loss. And this is a house that I loved. It was designed not by my father, but by a friend of his. They all went to architecture school together. Amale is his last name. And again, it was this kind of very aspirational modernist house. And it was built around a palm tree and really kind of negotiated the sea and the mountain in Lebanon. And this is my mother on the right and her sister. And they had just come back from living in Argentina, where my mother grew up, because my grandfather was ambassador to Buenos Aires. And so she actually didn't really grow up in Lebanon. But when they returned, my grandmother decided to, have a young architect design a kind of home for them.
That's beautiful. Was that the palm tree? Is that the palm tree there?
The palm tree that has grown along with all the urbanization around after the war. People were displaced according to religion, and so the whole town was rezoned to allow for new housing, and so.
It's hard to believe that that's actually the same. Can we go back one image there?
Yeah.
It's hard to believe that that's actually the same house and the same site.
Yeah.
The other buildings are so close.
Yeah, and now it's even worse. This was early 90s, so so yeah, things changed.
I guess as a first question, I'm curious about your relationship to your father's practice and how. I mean, clearly we could assume that it's been influential, but I'm wondering what you think that you may have taken away from his work and the work of his contemporaries. What was happening at that time that may have greatly influenced you?
I think that there was really an aspiration in the early days of kind of this embrace of modernism in in a kind of non-Eurocentric way, where climate and other cultures came in, and trying to hybridize these encounters and localize them. And there's a kind of softness to modernism in Beirut, and like as many cities that have kind of seen that in these intersections of hybridity. And I really. And I think he's a passionate historian. He's not a historian, but he's a lover of history, and really is always curious about the world. And I think that curiosity and that sense of experimentation, whether in later in materials, and I think was kind of very important for me, both the cultural hybridity aspect, but also the interest in innovative materials and technologies.
Yeah, and I suppose the architectural hybridity. Your father seems to have been one of the major proponents of kind of Lebanese modernism. So his kind of translation of his principles in a completely different atmosphere, cultural climate, etc.
Yeah, he loved Alto for that reason. Someone that was a little bit off the kind of dogma, and so I think a kind of anti-dogmatic approach to integrating these different cultures and histories was always present somehow in the work.
Yeah, I mean, I hope you don't mind, but I found this project, A Paradise Lost, by James Kerwin. In fact, I've never been to Lebanon. I've never been to Beirut. And I was, in reading about your work and thinking about your background, I wondered what the kind of traditional architecture that you may have been surrounded with, it's kind of a French colonial style that we see in these pictures in decay. And obviously that decay is the result of all of the conflicts that Lebanon has gone through since, I guess, the mid-70s. So when I look at this image, though, for example, Amala, I can directly...
Yes, the obsession with
yeah, it's incredible. It's really interesting. And obviously, we don't leave our history behind us. We carry it forward with us. So I wonder if you could just speak about your relationship to Lebanon and the...
It's been very interesting because I think when you move around a lot, you tend to compartmentalize things and close doors. And certainly, I think through the work, you find ways to reopen those doors. And the image you showed before is a typical Art Deco kind of building. And actually, I grew up in a very similar, very similar. It's a kind of tripartite.
Beautiful.
And it really is. It's this kind of hybrid from these houses that were built in the mountain, but also as the city urbanized, they started stacking these villas. So the first apartment buildings are almost like stacked villas with...
Wow.
Created this deep envelope in terms of verandas to really negotiate inside and outside. And there was a kind of democratization of let's say luxury, because all of this was built out of concrete. So concrete, so whereas the old houses were kind of built out of stone, suddenly the new bourgeoisie was built, really using concrete and casting. And so it's kind of very interesting social transformation and architectural transformation of this moment of kind of...
The multiple verandas and these kind of multiple arch spaces are I think somehow present in your contemporary as well.
And so it's this notion of the thickened facade or the envelope that you inhabit that can be very, very deep. That is a kind of real space of transition between inside and outside, between the public, in the Middle East, the kind of relationship of public to private is complex, and that veranda really negotiates. And it was a space of appearance and amazing for climate negotiation.
Right, of course.
And so what's interesting, maybe not in these buildings, but often the Art Deco buildings had a very simple Corbusian, domino, just concrete slabs, super basic. And then the ornamentation and the depth came in terms of these balconies. And so it's like this kind of layered envelope, with bracketing, something that's very modern and very basic. So
these spaces are just fantastic. I mean, it must be such a beautiful place. So then, moving on.
Complete different setting.
Yeah, complete different setting. But before we get into your contemporary work, there's a couple of things I wanted to know. I mean, I really appreciate the fact that, you think of yourself as a kind of cosmopolitan woman of the world and not a Lebanese immigrant. And I think that's really important, that, what you mentioned about compartmentalizing your experience, and there's certain aspects that you're carrying with you. So I'm wondering if you could speak just a little bit about what you may have learned in all of those other places that you lived. Of course, we know you studied at McGill in Canada, but in Saudi Arabia, you're dealing with a completely different context. Canada, of course, very different context. So,
yeah, I feel like I have a piece of everywhere, in me, and but I think, Saudi was very complicated, but also as a child, it was very much living outdoors. And so, the desert and the kind of openness, the town I was living in, which has since really urbanized, was pretty small. And so, we used to go to the beach a lot. And so the kind of outdoors, growing up a little, very, very kind of in a very sort of engaged with the environment was harsh, but it was nevertheless always present. And so I think that is something that I've, carried with me. Growing up in Paris, I think that there's a kind of, you never become French, but you never leave Frenchness behind in terms of.
I can understand that, never becoming French part for sure.
Also very complicated, but at the same time, just incredible culture and also I think it's kind of.
I mean, Paris, what a great city to kind of have spent some formative years in, especially as it relates to your work on cities, right? I mean,
and
those streets and the boulevards.
Beautiful city. I have to say, when I was living there, so it was from kind of mid 80s to early 90s, it also felt frozen and right, and a kind of beautiful, perfect
museum
city where people dress a certain way, very coded. And I think it's changed quite a bit since then. I think the relationship of the city to its suburbs is much more mixed and much more interesting and much more dynamic. When I was living there, it was kind of still this kind of the precious center, right? And so that it's been interesting to see that from afar, that transformation. But certainly, I think that the street life and in the U.S., I think what's interesting in kind of cities in Europe is work is not everything, right?
Of course,
it's pleasure and being social and your friendships and the time you spend with your family and this goes, it's really fundamental. I was, not laughing, but having this interesting conversation where, with COVID, there's a sense that in the US, if things settle, business might pick up again. But in Europe, everybody's going on holiday. It's like, I don't care. I think one really can respect the sense of valuing one's life outside of it, your
absolutely
terms of work.
It's almost as if you have your work self, your public self, right? And I'm thinking about the boulevards with the cafes outside, which we're beginning to kind of experience something like that now in the cities here. And then you have your private self, and how I also think about how you, besides living in all these different cities, how you're wearing so many hats in your personal and professional life. So how, being a mother of two, working with your partner, Dan, and your co-founded architecture practice, and being dean at Columbia University, I imagine it's quite a lot to juggle. And so, it's almost like you're Wonder Woman, right? How do you, if this isn't a strange question, how do you do it, right? Is something that really...
I think that, one is, in a way you do it and it's imperfect, right? I think you just jump in and that there's going to be, you can't keep all the balls up. But I think it's also about partnership and working with teams and, and being collaborative and, I can be dean and practice and be a mother if Dan wasn't there. He's just, it's really a partnership with him. I have at Columbia an incredible team that I work with, great faculty, so I really believe in team building and so that's the, partnerships are crucial.
Absolutely. It's the community that's supporting you along the way.
Community, and then that, I really enjoy teamwork, team building, and thinking through issues with others, and
So now that we see Dan, this is actually Dan Wood.
Dan, who grew up in a very different environment in rural Rhode Island, where we are right now, actually, and this is the first book we wrote together, called Above the Pavement, the Farm, which was a telling of the making of Public Farm 1 and how architecture can support creating these networks and these partnerships with farmers, scientists, etc. And
so this is 2008?
This is 2008. The book wasn't selling very well, so Dan decided to make a big, large series. But I think that in a way maybe the intersections came, this notion that architecture can do more, in terms of mobilizing ideas about cities and a certain wink to that PF1 was a kind of broken utopia. It was we were thinking about the kind of super studio, but then because the weight of the earth required us to bend the utopia and make it land. So anyway, I think that this was the beginning of kind of thinking about how through architecture we can kind of address larger issues and engage, kind of broader social.
Absolutely.
Network.
Your work at your practice, Work AC, is known for its intellectual analysis and kind of clever application, let's say, of architecture's relationship to nature. I'm thinking about publications like 49 Cities, which we're looking at here, projects like Public Farm 1, which you just referenced, Nature City, which is actually part of the 49 Cities, and the stunning Beirut Art Museum, which we'll hopefully talk more about. Can you give us a little introduction as to how you and Dan began the studio, how you came to work together, and where this kind of ecological lens is coming from prior to 49 Cities? I mean, I understand 49 Cities was kind of laying the academic.
Yeah. So we met actually when I was studying at the GSD with Rem Koolhaas on the Harvard project on the city. Dan was sort of working with him on leading all the American projects, and Rem was giving a lecture, and kind of we sort of, one of Dan's friends said, you have to meet this person. Anyway, so we dated for a while at a distance, and then finally I sent a fax to Rem because he only used to use fax, and I said, Rem, I want to go work for Frank Gehry. And he was like, what do you mean? You have to come to Rotterdam. That was my way to get a job at OMA, was to threaten that I was going to go to LA to work for Gehry. So I moved to Rotterdam and worked at OMA, and Dan was a kind of partner level and I was an intern. And it was an amazing experience. I think at the time, OMA was working on the Seattle Public Library, all the projects, Porto. It was a kind of golden era, a little bit for the office. And then we got married in 2001, 10 days before September 11 in Rotterdam. It was a real coming together of people from the Middle East and people from the US. And then after September 11, we, everybody was, work stopped in the office, all the American projects stopped, and everybody kind of needed to take stock of where they would move to. And for us, it was really a kind of process of, well, we can't, Dan doesn't speak Arabic or French, so the Middle East was sort of out. And then we didn't want to stay in Europe because you don't really become European. And so we tried LA. we tried LA for a few months, and then I hate driving. And so New York was a kind of almost default cosmopolitan, non-driving,
So interesting.
sort of a hinge between different parts of our lives. And so we settled in New York. We stayed with OMA for a year, and then launched Work AC soon after in 2003. And I think the interest in ecology came very soon, because it was, again, I think maybe it was how we grew up, or me in the desert and then in a kind of rural setting, but like this interest in thinking about the environment and its relationship to cities and to architecture and to making and maybe this kind of this modernism that negotiates climate in ways that the modernism and the kind of European modernism didn't do as well. So these ideas came together, and so we started working. We were interested in things like ecotourism, or we worked a little bit in Panama, and then soon we realized we started to teach at Princeton, which was really a great experience, and started a seminar on eco-urbanism, and 49 cities really came as a result of thinking that, well, at the time, there were already so many technologies. I mean, we've always had technology, but where are the ideas about kind of engaging, trying to bring together the urban and the rural and the natural, right? I mean, in a way.
So that was around, I guess, 2006.
Yeah. So from 2006, and then the research 2005, 2006, and then the research for 49 cities was done around then, and the first edition was published in 2007, I think.
So interesting, because here we are about 15 years later.
Yeah. Oh, I know.
The exhibition just closed at the Guggenheim, right? Rem Koolhaas, talking about the country.
Yeah.
So it's the groundwork was there quite a long time ago, and the work that you did in 49 cities is really fascinating. This analysis of all of these different cities drawn at exactly the same scale, and I think you mentioned something like you may have learned more about these cities than their original designers. So that's a really fascinating point.
And I think that's what's amazing about what we do. And when we draw, you don't know who is going to redraw your work and extract something new from it. But things like, everybody often one thinks about people like Solari, right, as someone who was very invested in thinking about scaling sustainable approaches to building. But his footprints for like his Mesa city was so large, right? So kind of just the exercise of using scale as a lens was very interesting. And then literally trying to imagine, okay, what is, how did architects imagine food getting into these cities, or what are the broader systems, or it was very kind of really great.
It seems like such a kind of simple way of thinking about cities, but this is actually the way that we've been thinking about cities from the beginning, right? In relation to people, in relation to people's needs.
Right.
And today we find ourselves almost so removed from the needs of the individuals, and more cities driven by market pressure, et cetera.
Yes.
That brings us to the Public Forum 1 here, which we're seeing an image of. I have to admit, I was there, and I'm not sure if I was there on opening day, but I went to quite a lot of these, and it's just such a great program.
It's a great program.
Yeah. So tell us a bit about Public Forum 1.
So it was really the idea of the urban farm, and how can we reimagine, after 49 cities, how can we think about food and cities in new ways, and so again, kind of the notion of this floating farm above the ground, but then sort of broken to allow for the weight of the soil, and then and we wanted it to be biodegradable, so it really I think it's still one of the largest paper structures ever built. I don't know where Shigeru was at, but
right.
um, and but beyond the design, which was kind of the flower became the structural module, and thinking about different fruit and vegetables and having it all be solar powered and using drip irrigation. It was a very humbling experience in terms of what it takes to grow food and to maintain something that's alive. I mean, I never had a summer where, well, now again, because we have a garden here, but like if it didn't rain for 3 days, we would worry about the plants, or the sense of care that as architects we don't always have when we leave projects, and also the network of people who worked on it and people who were maintaining it, and we kind of met different chefs and people who were committed to kind of rethinking food in cities, and it was just it's such an intersection that brings different people together. And it was
what was immediately apparent to me is that it wasn't about form, although there was this kind of massive, I think you described it as a farm bridge, this new architectural agricultural hybrid, right, of a kind of expression in structure. It was really apparent to me that it was about a set of ideas. The notion that you were coming with a concept that was trying to grow food at PS1, and also because there's some requirements, I think, right? And
it provided shade, and we had all the kind of shade, seating, a little pool, and some mist. So the kind of fun part of the farm was underneath, and then the productive roof, was above. And it was interesting because I know some people went and it didn't even exist for them, right? People were, and so you could also have architecture disappear, not. So it occupies the courtyard in a way that you can really exist underneath it, and it was very much a kind of about an idea and building this idea, and then things like, but then the building part is so crucial. I mean, who brings water and paper together? Like it, not so waterproofing, which is the little metal things, and
well, this kind of interweaving of structure and program and kind of conceptual, your own sort of conceptual leanings, which then go on to be part of many of your other projects, I thought was really fascinating. So in Public Farm 1, you're building upon what you learned in 49 cities. And here we're seeing an image of, Nature City. So Nature City was part of the 49 Cities project, right?
It was, in a way, it's our 50th city. We don't present it like that, but it was, if we were to design or to think about a city that would kind of be the 50th city, what would it be? And it was on the occasion of the MoMA and Buell Center's collaboration for Foreclosed, Rehousing the American Dream, that happened in 2011. We were one of 5 architects invited. And here it was kind of scaling up many of these ideas to imagine how housing could also perform as ecological infrastructure, as work environments, as areas for canning, as composting in entirely organic food, or reimagining what a core is inside a tower, and could it do more than just move people. And so a lot of ideas that we had been thinking about sort of came together in almost an excessive way.
Can we go back one image? I love how utopian this feels, right? Like how there's this series of gestures that are almost impossible to imagine, like the the internal waterfall, which is actually about water pressure, correct?
It's about water pressure, and kind of being able to just through that feed the neighborhood in terms of the water. But the interesting part though is that ideas like that tend to come back in projects. So we did a project for Libreville in Gabon, a conference center, and we had a waterfall. It didn't get built, but we had a kind of an actual waterfall that was part of recycling the water in the building. So, but we had a business plan for this project. We still, but it was was very amazing group to think through issues of land, issues of property, the public versus the private, and and then where architecture and urbanism come in to both invite a different way of living, but also kind of enable other species to exist at the same time, and and think about density and sort of ideas about ecology at the same time.
If I'm not mistaken, you were bringing more green space, higher density and more green space. Tell us about that ratio.
It was like 5 times more green and open space than in the kind of adjacent suburban model, and it was a polemical, provocative exercise to say, yes, I mean the town country that Ebenezer Howard first was trying to promote was bringing together these two things, because that's what people want, right? They want to be with other people, but they want to also have access to nature, to green space, etc. And so our challenge was, can we do both? Can we intensify both density of people and density and variety of different kinds of green spaces, productive spaces, leisure spaces, sort of unaccessible spaces, etc.
The gestures really feel idealized, but at the same time, they're functional, and their goal is to kind of be in service, right?
Yeah, and to and it was a little bit, again, provocative in saying, here, if you want to live this way in stacked housing, you can. If you want, just because of course the suburban model is to have a very reduced number of types. There's so many rules, zoning, kind of even segregation, in terms of who can be there, who cannot. I mean, there's, and so this was almost going the other way to be excessive in choice, almost, or in
and somehow it's still, for me, there's something reminiscent of the architecture of Lebanon in that tower. And I don't know why I immediately saw, in terms of the geometry and the structure. It's fascinating how it still continues. So you were also involved in the Edible Schoolyard project.
Yeah, right? So it's not common that, I don't think it's common that the PS1 competition leads to immediately an actual project, but it was very exciting. John Lyons, one of the collaborators of Alice Waters' Edible Schoolyard, started Edible Schoolyard NYC.
The Parnese Foundation.
Exactly, and wanted to take the model from Berkeley to New York. And so with our experience in terms of, how to grow food in the city, we developed these kitchen classrooms and gardens, and we did 2 of those, one in Brooklyn and the second one in Harlem, in public schools, turning the parking lot into organic kind of small farm that kids learn how to engage with, grow food, and then there's a curricular aspect in the kitchen classroom where, if they're
incredible
about science, they can learn about science through food or culture, or I think in the Brooklyn Edible Schoolyard, which is a sort of a little bit of a flagship, every student has a class like 2 classes a month at least, or and it's become a sort of community space as well.
You described it as an interlinked, sustainable system. So there's a number of, I guess, infrastructural systems that are all kind of self self-sustaining, right? The entire school is off the grid. Is that correct?
So the building itself is, well, we were trying to make it off the grid, but working with the school construction authority that didn't come through.
Right.
But
Right.
but the idea is the kind of water is recycled, and there's a cistern,
Mm-hmm.
and
Compost.
there's compost, there's a chicken coop, and the shape of the building itself, is a little bit playful, for almost a kind of pedagogical puzzle for kids to understand. This is the systems wall, this is where the cistern is, this is the slope of the roof, this is how water collects, and to kind of almost make that connection between the garden and the building almost literal.
Yeah. I love the fact that it's beginning with education, and in fact, Alice Waters was very much inspired by Montessori.
Yes.
I have a quote here. She says, Dr. Montessori really believed that the senses needed to be educated, that there are pathways into our mind. And so the idea of something looking right and being able to touch, to be able to smell, to be able to taste, to hear, to listen, these are all ways that we can reach people and awaken them. So, the Edible Schoolyard project is very much about connecting students to all aspects of life, let's say.
Yeah, and there were, I think what's interesting about some of how Alice Waters translated those ideas to architecture, she had very specific ideas about the kitchen, for example. The fact that this needed to be almost like a even though it had some commercial aspect in terms of the kinds of cooking that could happen, the heights the heights were not meant to be children's heights. They had to be residential heights, so that when the kids at home, they could own the kitchen. They would pick up a stool, and so there was a real thought process in terms of how not to make it overly kid friendly, and to this is life, and when you go home,
this is real life.
And I thought that was really great.
Absolutely. So I guess we'll look at a few more projects where you begin to kind of integrate these concepts of nature and architecture and infrastructure and ecology. I believe this is anthropology.
This is a one-off anthropology. It was.
I wish they were all like this.
I know. They went a little wild, and then they were like, I think we're going to come back to our.
It's incredible.
Concept. But it was a great collaboration in terms of this is a lifestyle mall, so you had guidelines about height of the building and the color of the facade, and so how do you break these guidelines? They're like, okay, we'll give you the facade, but we're going to cover it in vines that are actually growing around circles, so they're not they're really graphic and kind of constructed, and then how do you articulate the facade so that you even in the store create areas where you can sit outside and have shade, and then imagine, I think this is why that was it, because in the middle of the store there's like a non-shoppable area. yeah which is this very large courtyard.
It's beautiful. It's like a vitrine reminding you of all of the.
And originally there were orange trees in that courtyard, because before the lifestyle mall, it was all the kind of orange tree grove, and then it got hot, so they replaced the vegetation. So I mean, I think this is also what's interesting is, again, architecture can tend to be static, but the moment you integrate living materials and they really transform. Or here's the Edible Schoolyard. Things got flipped. Okay. This is the one in Brooklyn. So the greenhouse, the kitchen, classroom, and you see in the back the systems wall, which is literally like a kit of parts.
Okay, and can we go back one image? What is the? Oh yeah, this is the.
Like the cistern. It's like the enlarged infrastructural wall of the chicken coop and this cistern and the air units
and the outdoor space, of course.
And the outdoor space, and again, I think it's been great in terms of becoming a focus of the community. They have classes there, and
Well, the idea of the school extending beyond the building itself, the building envelope, I think is very interesting. To say that the school is integrated into the way of life, right?
Yeah.
And the
And the urban, and the kind of becomes a hinge between the kind of school part and the community beyond, so yeah, it's been. We hope there'll be a third one. We don't know.
Do you know how many of these exist? The Edible Schoolyard. How many projects they've built?
So in New York right now, there's only these two, and what they've done is they've really worked on programming and pop-ups and building on these two models.
There's one in San Francisco, though, correct?
Yes, and the original one is in Berkeley.
Berkeley, right.
There was one, I think there's one in New Orleans also. I'm not sure beyond that if they've expanded. I think that Alice herself has been very, as many, I think, as also now pivoted to policy and really trying to influence kids' food and, and so trying to influence policy, and so it's been interesting, yeah.
So the next project is I believe a private residence, if I'm not mistaken, or what are we looking at here?
Yeah, so this is it's a condominium building. It's actually for the first project we've done with the developer, but all about preserving this beautiful cast iron building in Tribeca.
Incredible.
Landmarked, really gorgeous, and then kind of transforming the interior. And the client wanted to add a penthouse, a rooftop, but because of landmark, it became all about how do you make it invisible, and so that became the project, is to really add a penthouse that was completely invisible from the street.
See the next. Okay, yeah, here it is.
And so the idea was to kind of pick up the lines, hide the penthouse, and its form is really picking up on the lines of the bulkhead and of the adjacent building and the elevator bulkhead, and sort of interpolating that to create this sort of crenulated roof, and recessing enough to create, again, this kind of outdoor courtyard type.
The roof actually feels like a kind of topography.
Like a topography.
Yeah, it feels like the earth transported to the top of the building somehow.
The building, and we collaborated with Michael Hansmeyer on the capitals were gone. And because we couldn't find historical information on them, Landmarks was fine with us not replacing them, but we thought we should really try to do something. And Hans Meyer's work's been very interesting in kind of scripting, and so we invited him to think about what a 21st century Corinthian column would look like. So these are completely 3D printed and
oh, beautiful.
Yeah.
Are they made in concrete?
Yeah, it's GFRC, and the resolution was pretty good. So,
yeah.
From afar, you can't tell they're not original or old.
And the Rhode Island School of Design Student Center.
Yeah. So again, thinking about education today and how it's changing. The student center is really very, very flexible space that brings together everything from the registrar to career services to flexible gallery space to the desire to be able to have, classrooms. So we have these curtains that become sort of small classroom spaces. But then what was interesting, the building, it was partly an interior renovation, and then partly in the back, the building had this elevated parking lot. And I guess we just like to infill parking lots, but the part of the program was to create a mail room. And then as we were, kind of discussing the requirements for the mailroom, it became obvious that a room wasn't going to be enough. Students, get packages from around the world every day. I mean, even like food from different parts of Asia, or just incredible. So we said, you really need like almost like a new version of the post office, a sort of mail building that becomes a kind of community space for the students. And so we proposed this kind of mail building, and then, given that we were going to build something new anyway, said, why don't we also create a gallery, a flexible kind of event space on the other side. And so this is actually the back of the building, and it's a kind of infill. And it's really just, and then students get called, they get a message that their package arrived. The packages, on the right-hand side are delivered, they're stored, they're fridges. And then in the front, there's this kind of idea that, as they open up the package, the cardboard is left there. Then the next student comes, picks up the cardboard to make their artwork. So, again, thinking about a kind of cycle where people meet, but also there's a kind of transfer. And so.
I see we're getting some questions in the chat, and there's still obviously the Beirut Museum.
Yeah, you can jump. I don't have to talk so much.
Yeah, no, I would love to get to. I mean, these are incredible. But obviously, so that we don't completely run out of time and we save some time for questions, I wanted to return back to Beirut with this project. And if I'm not mistaken, this is your first architectural project in Lebanon. Is that correct?
It's the second. We just completed a series of houses, on the beach. But this is the first urban project in Beirut. Yeah.
Okay. So this project is slated to open in 2023. Maybe, hopefully. Hopefully, if we could just go back to that
Make
first
it 2023. So I mean, this I think picks up on a lot of the ideas we spoke about at the beginning. The thickened envelope, the balconies, the ideas that the balconies can be rooms, outdoor rooms with different expressions. And in this case, we thought, what if it's almost like a community space that's accessible even when the museum is closed, but also sort of a kind of sculpture garden that's vertical and really I think creates a new relationship between museum and city, or between art and life. And
absolutely, it's fascinating, the idea that these are also spaces that the museum can kind of move into or grow into.
Yeah, that's great. We never get this question, but part of the strategy was because we thought the program was too big. That was given in the competition. So we actually said, why don't you start smaller and condition the core, which is like the Art Deco buildings, very, very simple slide, and then create this thickened, very expressive facade. And in the end, if you need more room, you can start closing off.
So smart.
Some of these spaces.
And to witness that evolution, right? Like the building as a kind of living work of architecture, transforming over time, right? And what I also found fascinating, Amale, is that there are very few museums that speak about a kind of new kind of artwork being created in response to the museum. I mean, the examples that I can think of are historic, right? The Guggenheim being the primary one. Yeah. But when I saw this project, I immediately wondered, it kind of forces you to ask, like, what would you display there?
Right.
And there's a kind of constant reminder, even to artists walking by, that there's this opportunity to think about an artwork which is public, but still inside the museum.
That's right. And to, at what scale do you do it? At what distance do you experience it? And also, to be able to support, and there's an amazing amazing art scene, but how do you support the next generation of artists, and so it's almost like distributed small project rooms, um, and I think in a way it's been interesting because some of these questions have come up, like what about dust, and what about like there's a lot of
Right.
and,
Sure.
but that's, I think, part of it is, well, what about public art, and I think today we are questioning the museum and the sort of elite enclosed.
Yeah, it's literally a breakdown of the facade, the
Yes.
limitations of what is commercial, what is commercially accessible as art, and what is public art, right? The idea that the building provides as the entire facade as another kind of museum to the public, like this elevation is fantastic.
Yeah, and it's taking the balcony, which is an everyday device that everybody, many people, spend time in, and it's been interesting to think about the balcony and this notion of outdoor space, even in light of COVID today. Like if you have a balcony, you're in a better place than if you don't. The capacity to go outdoors, and so kind of appropriating that.
Yeah, and at night, I mean, and obviously it's responding to the climate of Lebanon, and giving that kind of access at night is fantastic. It's the building becomes a kind of lamp, and available at various scales. So I guess we're quickly running out of time.
Fine, yeah.
I wish I had 2 hours to talk to you, but I think we should probably. If there's anything more that you'd like to say, Amale, about this project, we should probably hand it over to questions.
No, I mean, I think it will still transform in light of the situation in Lebanon now, and that was always the intention, that it would, so I think, but it will happen in some form, and it's about, kind of being hopeful and kind of supporting civic engagement, and so sort of still working on it and shaping it in new ways.
Absolutely. Okay, so we're going to open it up for questions with Amale. I'm just going through the chat right now, looking for the first questions. I believe we have a lot of greetings from all over. And I thought we had a question from Washington, Fajardo, here we are. Washington, are you with us? Would you like to ask your question directly? I don't know, hello? I can't hear him, but maybe I'll just read his question. He asks, Amale, can you please share your vision or thoughts on design education? Obviously, this is a whole chapter that we didn't get to talk about. Especially after the crisis and the pandemic experience.
Yeah.
How is GSAP planning to respond?
Yeah, I think there's many crises and many opportunities right now that are intersecting, that we are really reflecting on, but also trying to engage very actively. On the one hand, I think the school's been really committed to climate change and understanding how, as architects, as planners, as urban designers, we have to really mobilize, given the impact that it's going to have not only on cities, but on the most vulnerable population.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
I think, COVID has really brought that to the forefront, right? The fact that COVID has impacted so intensely, Black communities of color, vulnerable communities around the world. I mean, what we've been thinking about, almost kind of, I mean, we know that climate is already happening, but the intensity of how COVID has impacted different places and different people in different ways has been a kind of a wake-up call. And there's a real sense of urgency in terms of, I think as a school, I've been really kind of supportive of this idea of engaged practice and how do we empower students to practice in a new way. But I think we have to intensify that almost beyond the kind of boutique practice. And so And then, we're very much now engaged in, so there's a kind of climate, there's COVID and vulnerability, and also now really, I just, before this meeting, had a, we're really thinking, what would a anti-racist GSAP look like,
Yeah.
and really mobilizing conversations and this kind of intense introspection from the faculty, amazing letters from our students demanding change, and we want to change, and it's going to take time, but reflecting on our disciplines and practice and how we can really transform ourselves through how we teach, what we teach, who's in the room. And so it's an amazing time. It's a very complicated time, and I think to just the question of design education, there's such urgency to engage and to on the ground with all these issues, but also to engage critically and undo our histories and decenter them and
it's a very exciting moment. And I think in your case, it's at the GSAP, obviously, with such an international faculty and student body, you're looking at the global and the local at the same time.
Yeah, and that tension right now is incredible. I think, and how to productively and positively not negotiate, but like move forward to, it's not either or, it's and together, and not feel like one is displacing the other. And so,
last week we spoke a lot about social practice, which is I don't know, maybe the description didn't exist some time ago, but obviously it encompasses this kind of collective consciousness that we're all entering into. And I almost feel like the future is about how we design improving relations between one another.
Yeah.
Right. And so
a beautiful way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the care with which we design. And in your work, you're thinking about who makes things and where they come from and how they
trying.
What is their histories, and if we could scale up that care, I think I think that's what we should kind of strive for, right?
Absolutely. I suppose that's probably all we have time for.
I'm around. It was a great pleasure, and I know we're gonna have you in the fall to present your work. Watch for an invitation.
All right.
But I'm, as an alum, I'm very also always love to follow your work, and just really very inspiring.
Well, your work's incredibly inspiring too, Amale. Thank you so much for spending this hour with us.
Thank you.
Before we go, I would just like to mention that on Friday, July 24th, Glenn Adamson is going to be in conversation with Iris van Herpen, the incredibly innovative fashion designer from the Netherlands. So you all can make that as well. Once again, thank you, Amale. Really enjoyed this hour.
Thank you, Stephen. To be continued.
Yeah, to be continued. We'd be in touch soon.
Okay, thanks so much.